The summer of 1066 in England unfolded under an uneasy calm, the kind of silence that comes before a storm whose arrival is known yet unavoidable. Across the northern shires, the rivers ran sluggish and the fields shimmered under the heat of late August. But beneath this pastoral surface, the kingdom simmered with tension. The death of King Edward the Confessor the previous January had left the crown contested, and three claimants eyed it with growing impatience. Among them, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, had seized the throne in London, consolidating power with the shrewdness of a seasoned politician. But power, in those days, was measured not only in titles or gold. It was measured in armies, in fleets, in the ability to respond before rivals could act. From across the North Sea, a different threat was emerging. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a man whose reputation had been forged in a lifetime of war, from the fjords of Norway to the steppes of Byzantium, set his gaze on England. Hardrada was no stranger to calculated risk. His fleets had crossed oceans, his soldiers had fought in lands far beyond Norway, and he understood the power of surprise. His plan was audacious. Strike before Harold could fully consolidate his forces, and seize a kingdom that had been destabilized by succession disputes. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson faced a problem of timing that would soon prove fatal. Word arrived of a Viking fleet, small but highly mobile, landed near the mouth of the Humber River. Scouts reported a force numbering no more than a few thousand warriors, far outnumbered by Harold's levies. Yet, reports of these Norsemen carried an undercurrent of dread. These were not raiders who sought loot and retreat. They were seasoned warriors, hardened by decades of continuous campaigning. Every step they took was measured, every decision honed by experience in battlefields across Europe. Harold had to act. His intelligence was fragmentary, reports arriving from a patchwork network of local thanes and village scouts, each message carrying delays of hours, sometimes days. Yet even these fragments painted a dangerous picture. The Vikings had moved inland from their landing points, striking swiftly at smaller settlements, seizing food, burning what they could not carry, and demonstrating a mobility that outpaced anything Harold's slower, supply-bound army could manage. To wait was to allow them to entrench, to consolidate positions, to prepare for a confrontation on terms of their choosing. Action, therefore, became inevitable. The strategic landscape of northern England shaped Harold's options. The terrain favored mobility, but also demanded vigilance. The River Derwent, cutting through marshes and low-lying fields, created natural choke points. Forested ridges flanked open plains, offering potential ambush positions. In theory, Harold's larger force could envelop a smaller Viking contingent if he could force a pitched battle. But theory rarely survived first contact with an enemy like Hardrada's men. These Norse warriors excelled in flexible formations, in sudden charges, and in turning what seemed like a frontal attack into a trap. Harold's march north was swift but taxing. He had assembled a large army from southern shires, calling upon infantry levied from towns, thanes retainers, and experienced housecarls, heavy infantry whose discipline was formidable. Yet, discipline alone does not erase fatigue. By the time Harold's force reached the vicinity of York, they had already marched nearly 180 miles in a matter of days, driven by urgency and the ever-present fear of losing the initiative. Horses and wagons struggled across narrow bridges and marshy terrain, while foot soldiers bore the full brunt of sun, wind, and the constant strain of armor and weapons. News came that the Viking force had entrenched near a small settlement called Stamford Bridge, east of York. The village itself offered limited natural defenses, a river on one side, scattered hedgerows, a mix of woodland and open ground, but it was sufficient to create a defensive perimeter if used with skill. Harold Hardrada's men had secured the bridges. Scouts reported and had placed sentries along the approaches. Though their numbers were smaller, they held the advantage of preparation, high morale, and the certainty that the enemy would be forced into attack. Harold Godwinson faced a calculation that demanded both speed and precision. His army was larger, yes, but size could become a liability. In narrow approaches, the advantage of numbers diminished. Crossing rivers or negotiating hedgerows could slow advance units, breaking cohesion and leaving flanks exposed. If the Vikings could strike first, using spears and archers to harry the advancing English, Harold's men could be funneled into kill zones. And yet, hesitation carried an equal threat. If he delayed the scout, Hardrada could exploit the time to gather reinforcements, raid further, or even withdraw, leaving Harold's army exhausted and dispersed over hostile territory. The march to Stamford Bridge was more than a maneuver. It was a test of command under pressure. Harold divided his forces carefully, leaving detachments to guard supply lines and key crossing points. He relied on experienced commanders to manage units that had never fought together before, trusting their training and his orders to hold coherence under stress. Every mile brought them closer to confrontation, every step increasing both anticipation and anxiety. Soldiers whispered of the Norse king, of the berserker legends, of men who fought without fear, who would stand their ground to the death. As the English army neared the village, scouts returned with reports that confirmed their fears. The Vikings had established a defensive cordon, with pickets on the bridges and hedgerows cleared to create open approaches. Archers and spearmen were positioned to maximize effect in the narrow crossings, meaning any frontal assault would be met with concentrated resistance. Yet, despite these obstacles, Harold pressed forward. He understood that speed could compensate for caution. His men were disciplined, his housecarls heavily armored and trained to withstand initial volleys of missiles. Momentum, he calculated, might be enough to shatter the defenders before they could exploit the terrain fully. In the village itself, preparations by the Vikings demonstrated strategic foresight. Supplies were gathered, lines of retreat mapped, and positions reinforced where the terrain offered advantage. Hardrada, observing from a central position, had no illusions about being outnumbered. His focus was on maximizing the defensive value of every feature, on compelling Harold's army to fight on terms that minimize their numerical superiority. Even the smallest tactical decision, a sharpened palisade, a cleared line of sight, a bridge guarded with concentrated spear points, was designed to impose delay, to force fatigue, and create a psychological edge over the advancing English. By the late afternoon, both armies were poised at the threshold of conflict. The air was heavy, almost tactile, with the anticipation of battle. For the English, the sight of the Norse banners and the disciplined ranks of hardened warriors was intimidating, yet familiar. For the Vikings, the looming mass of English infantry and cavalry represented an opportunity, an enemy whose size could be turned against itself if maneuvered correctly. Each commander understood that the forthcoming engagement would not be determined solely by strength of arms. Fatigue, terrain, morale, and timing would play decisive roles, perhaps more so than the sheer weight of the larger English force. And so, in the shadow of the Derwent and among the open fields of Stamford Bridge, the stage was set. The forces were arrayed not in grand spectacle, but in quiet readiness, and almost clinical tension, where every movement was deliberate, every order measured. The coming clash would not be marked by fanfare or heralds, but by the grinding calculus of war. Pressure applied, decisions made, consequences unfolding in real time. In these hours, the outcome remained uncertain, but one fact was already clear. In the narrow, sunlit valley of Stamford Bridge, a confrontation was imminent that would test leadership endurance and the very limits of tactical understanding in ways that would resonate far beyond the fields themselves. Dawn broke over Stamford Bridge with an almost deceptive serenity. Mist clung to the low-lying fields and the slow-moving Derwent, drifting across the wooden bridge that spanned its waters. To an observer unacquainted with war, it was a pastoral scene. Green fields, a thin ribbon of river, and scattered farmsteads. But for those who had endured the march north or the crossing from Norway, the quiet carried the weight of imminent violence. Each side surveyed the other, measuring size, position, and disposition, as the morning light revealed the stark realities of their opposing formations. Harold Godwinson's army, while fatigued from the forced march, was a formidable sight. Housecarls formed the core, heavily armed infantry, disciplined in shield wall tactics, their axes and swords polished to a lethal sheen. Surrounding them were the Thane's levies, younger and less experienced but numerous, and scattered units of mounted troops, intended to exploit any breach or flank opportunity. In total, Harold commanded a force estimated at 15,000 men, an army built not just on numbers, but on the cohesion of trained veterans leading citizen levies. Yet cohesion would soon be tested. Across the bridge, the Viking force, far smaller, perhaps no more than 8,000, was already in defensive positions. Harald Hardrada's men, were veterans of campaigns stretching from the cold coast of Norway to the sun-scorched plains of Byzantium. Shields were locked, spears planted at angles to impede charges, and light axes poised for rapid response. The Vikings had prepared for the English assault with meticulous attention. The bridge itself was partially blocked, pickets positioned to give warning, and every approach surveyed to minimize the effectiveness of Harold's numerical advantage. Even the riverbanks were scouted, ensuring that the English could not easily ford without exposing themselves to concentrated missile fire. The initial engagement hinged on one small but decisive point: the wooden bridge over the Derwent. To Harold's commanders, it was an obstacle but also a potential fulcrum. Forcing troops across in coordinated waves could bring the full weight of the English army to bear in a single, overwhelming push. Yet even a single misstep could turn this crossing into a death trap. Narrow, slippery planks limited movement. Heavy shields and armor slowed men down, making them vulnerable to spears and arrows. In essence, Harold faced a problem of geometry and timing. His advantage in numbers was neutralized so the enemy could control the choke point effectively. Harald Hardrada understood this implicitly. He positioned a small contingent of elite warriors, likely 40 to 50 men, directly on the bridge. These men were heavily armed, their discipline absolute. They were instructed to hold at all costs, not merely to resist, but to buy time for the main body to respond and flank any crossing attempt. Historical accounts later emphasize this moment. One Viking, reputedly standing alone at the bridge, repelled multiple assaults, cutting down English soldiers one by one. Though embellished in legend, it reflects the tactical principle Hardrada relied upon: defense in depth, turning every narrow passage into a force multiplier. The first clash came mid-morning. English housecarls surged forward, shield walls interlocking, axes raised, pressing against the bridge defenders. The confined space forced the English into tight formations, limiting their ability to swing weapons effectively. The Vikings responded with disciplined spear thrusts, coordinated rotations of shield bearers, and concentrated attacks at exposed limbs. Even though vastly outnumbered in theory, the Norsemen leveraged terrain and preparation to create the illusion of superior strength. The bridge became a lethal funnel, where every advance was met with a calculated counter, every step forward exacting a cost in men and morale. Beyond the bridge, the main body of the Viking force adapted fluidly. Some warriors deployed along hedgerows and ditches, ready to disrupt any flanking attempt, while others positioned themselves on high ground, providing observation and archery support. Hardrada's strategy emphasized flexible response. The smaller force could absorb pressure, feign weakness, and counterattack where English formations faltered. This required exceptional discipline and timing, and it is here that Viking cohesion, built through years of continuous combat, revealed its full potency. The English army's progress was halting. Even with repeated waves, the bridge proved resistant. Soldiers grew fatigued, tension mounting with each casualty, and discipline began to strain under the unrelenting resistance. The psychological effect was profound. The English had expected a rout of a smaller Viking force, yet instead encountered a defense that seemed almost preternaturally coordinated. For commanders like Harold, the calculus became ever more complex. Press harder and risk catastrophic losses, or pause and allow the enemy to reinforce and possibly retreat under cover. Meanwhile, cavalry units, which Harold had intended to exploit for decisive flanking, struggled to find space. The approach roads were narrow, flanked by hedges and soft fields. Horses slipped in mud, units became intermingled, and coordination with infantry faltered. The Norsemen used this to their advantage. Small detachments emerged from cover, striking at disordered English riders, then melting back into hedgerows before a countercharge could be mounted. It was a microcosm of the battle at large. Superior numbers constrained by terrain, harried by a smaller, highly disciplined opponent. As the morning progressed, the pressure on the Vikings intensified. English forces eventually forced a breakthrough at the bridge, a costly but pivotal moment. Housecarls poured across, cutting down defenders and forcing Hardrada's men to retreat into the village itself. Yet this advance brought new challenges. The village streets were narrow and twisting, limiting the effectiveness of massed English infantry. Spearmen and archers occupied choke points, creating pockets of resistance that repeatedly slowed progress. Every building, every hedge, every slight elevation became a defensive anchor. Harald Hardrada's leadership during this phase was decisive. He remained near the center, directing reserves and reinforcing threatened points. His ability to read the battlefield, to identify where English momentum was strongest, allowed him to counterbalance the numerical disadvantage. When a bridgehead threatened to collapse entirely, small detachments were sent to harry the flanks, striking with axes and disappearing into cover. Coordination between units that were small in size but tightly knit proved lethal against the slower-moving, less flexible English formations. By late morning, the fighting had transformed from a single chokepoint clash to a series of interconnected engagements across the fields and village approaches. Both sides experienced confusion and fatigue. Soldiers on either side lost orientation, unable to distinguish between friend and foe in the swirling melee. The bridge that had been the focal point of the initial assault was now a secondary consideration. Battle had become decentralized, fragmented, and intensely personal. Fatigue, heat, and the psychological strain of constant threat wore down men who had marched, fought, and carried equipment for days. At this stage, the English army was not yet broken, but cracks were forming. Housecarls, usually impenetrable in shield wall formation, began to suffer casualties that forced rotation and temporary withdrawal. Levy troops, less disciplined, showed signs of panic in isolated encounters, particularly where Viking detachments exploited gaps in the line. Each loss of cohesion increased vulnerability, creating openings for counterattack. It is in these small fractures, not in large set-piece maneuvers, that Hardrada's strategic advantage emerged. A smaller, cohesive force could impose maximum pressure where the enemy was weakest, avoiding direct confrontation with their mass while extracting disproportionate effect. By midday, Stamford Bridge had become a battlefield defined by microtactics as much as by strategy. Every house, hedge, and ditch had become a weapon or a liability, and every decision, whether to advance, rotate troops, or reinforce a threatened sector, carried immediate consequences. The English commanders understood the scale of what they faced. They had forced their way past initial defenses, but had paid heavily in blood and morale. The Norse, meanwhile, leveraged every defensive position, every experience of prior campaigns, to prolong engagement, sap strength, and prepare for the eventual counter that could turn the tide. By early afternoon, Stamford Bridge had become a maelstrom of exhaustion, steel, and blood. The initial English momentum had slowed, and the battlefield's microtactical complexity now dictated the flow of combat. The Norsemen, though fewer in number, had transformed every hedge, ditch, and bridge into a defensive instrument. They had absorbed the first assaults, imposed continuous pressure, and now began to exploit the openings created by the relentless march of Harold's troops. Fatigue, miscoordination, and overextension began to erode the English advantage. The decisive moment came not from a single charge or heroic act, but from the subtle collapse of cohesion under pressure. English housecarls, usually disciplined and reliable, were already spread thin across multiple fronts. Units advancing to the village streets became separated, their shield walls disrupted by narrow alleys, sudden ditches, and the unpredictable movement of levy troops. Norse spearmen and axemen struck at these gaps, cutting down isolated soldiers and forcing localized withdrawals. Every small disruption amplified stress across the larger formation, as commanders struggled to relay orders amidst the chaos of sound, motion, and blood. Harald Hardrada's counterattacks were timed with precision. Detachments that had absorbed the English assault at the bridge now emerged from cover, exploiting weak points in flanks and rear formations. They used the natural terrain to their advantage. Higher ground, soft mud along riverbanks, and hedgerows that masked movement. The Norse were not merely defending. They were shaping the battlefield, forcing Harold's larger army to fight on unfavorable terms. Where the English pressed forward, they encountered ambush. Where they attempted to flank, they were channeled into pre-prepared kill zones. It was a textbook demonstration of force multiplication through terrain, timing, and disciplined tactical response. Psychologically, the effect on Harold's army was profound. Soldiers who had expected a swift victory now confronted relentless resistance, unpredictable counterattacks, and mounting casualties. The shock of repeated failures to secure terrain that seemed easily taken eroded confidence. Levy troops, untested in prolonged combat, began to falter, creating gaps that spread tension and fear through neighboring units. Even the housecarls, conditioned to withstand tremendous pressure, felt the strain as friends and comrades fell in exposed positions. The battlefield had become a crucible, testing the mental as well as the physical limits of every soldier. Hardrada, observing the pressure points, directed concentrated strikes that exploited these fractures. A handful of elite warriors, moving like shadows, cut through weakened lines, targeting command points and disrupting coordination. English officers attempting to regroup scattered troops were frequently interrupted by sudden attacks, forcing pauses and localized retreats. Each intervention was small, measured, and cumulative. It was a war of attrition conducted not through numbers alone, but through precision and understanding of enemy psychology. The tipping point arrived in the late afternoon. One of the English flanking maneuvers, intended to roll up the Viking defenses from the side, became entangled in hedgerows and ditches. Troops became isolated, shield walls disjointed, and communication between units collapsed. Hardrada's men exploited this moment ruthlessly. A counterattack struck the disordered flank, encircling units and forcing surrender or annihilation. Momentum shifted irreversibly. The English army, though still numerically superior, had lost the structural integrity that made its size an advantage. Chaos replaced organization, and panic spread among those at the periphery. Harold's leadership was tested under conditions that would have challenged any commander. He attempted to rally troops, reposition reserves, and re-establish coherent lines. Yet the speed and precision of Viking countermeasures, combined with the cumulative fatigue of his men, rendered many efforts ineffective. Where once the English army had pressed forward with coordinated purpose, it now reacted to threats rather than imposing its will. Hardrada's strategy had succeeded. The smaller force dictated the rhythm of battle, turning the larger army's strength into a liability. By evening, the Norsemen were no longer merely defending. They were driving the English back. Every advance was met with a counter that exploited terrain, coordination, and experience. The English army's flanks folded under pressure. Units became trapped in narrow lanes, and the bridge over the Derwent became a secondary defensive line for the retreating forces. Soldiers exhausted from the march, the heat, and the relentless engagement were easy prey for sudden, disciplined strikes. The psychological impact compounded the physical. The perception of invincibility eroded, fear magnified every setback, and what remained of the English army increasingly fought in fragments rather than a coherent force. The culmination of these dynamics was catastrophic. Harold's army, once confident and imposing, fractured into isolated pockets. Retreats became disorderly, and even experienced housecarls could not maintain cohesion under relentless pressure and surprise attacks. Casualties mounted sharply. Those who survived the initial clashes were often trapped in confined spaces or forced to wade across the river under fire. The Norsemen, disciplined and mobile, struck where English troops were vulnerable, conserving energy and minimizing exposure to counterattack. The battle, which had begun as a numerical contest, had been transformed into a decisive tactical execution by the smaller but more agile force. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the field of Stamford Bridge bore the grim marks of annihilation. Thousands of English soldiers lay dead or dying, and the once mighty army was reduced to disorganized remnants. The Norse had held, counterattacked, and forced a larger force to collapse under the weight of terrain, fatigue, and disciplined resistance. Their casualties were severe, but proportionally far less, a testament to the power of preparation, terrain mastery, and strategic patience. Harald Hardrada's gamble, landing a smaller force deep in enemy territory and using terrain and tactical acumen to negate numerical disadvantage, had succeeded beyond expectation. The aftermath rippled far beyond the battlefield. England had been forced into a sudden, devastating loss just weeks before the Norman invasion. Harold Godwinson, weakened and drained by Stamford Bridge, faced the next threat almost immediately at Hastings. The psychological shock of witnessing an elite, disciplined force decimate a numerically superior army left an enduring mark on contemporary chronicles. Strategic lessons were evident. Size alone does not ensure victory. Mobility and cohesion can outweigh mass, and leadership under stress, reading terrain, time, and morale, can dictate the outcome against seemingly insurmountable odds.